Welcome to Life Stories, where the power of courage, love, and resilience takes center stage. Today's story begins deep in the Appalachian wilderness, where a young girl named Ellie faces incredible challenges to save her ailing mother. But fate takes an unexpected turn when she encounters a wounded stranger in the woods. What unfolds is a tale of compassion, hope, and the unbreakable bonds that transform lives forever. Join us as we explore this heartwarming journey of second chances and new beginnings. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories and start today's inspiring tale with us. Deep in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, where the forest stretched endlessly and the trees whispered secrets to the wind, a humble cabin stood weathered by time. This cabin, with its creaking walls and smoke-stained roof, was home to Ellie and her mother, Margaret. Their lives, though marked by struggle, were intertwined with the wild beauty of their surroundings, a beauty that often masked the harshness of their reality. Ellie, just a teenager, bore the weight of responsibilities far beyond her years. Her mother, once vibrant and strong, had been ravaged by illness. Margaret's frail body lay motionless on the single bed in the corner of their one-room cabin, her breaths shallow and her skin pale. The morning sunlight filtered through a cracked window, casting golden streaks across the room. But it did little to warm the chill that clung to Ellie's heart. Margaret's illness had crept in like a thief in the night, stealing her strength and leaving Ellie to fend for them both. The meager provisions they had managed to gather before winter were nearly gone. The cupboard held little more than a crust of stale bread and a few shriveled potatoes, mocking Ellie's efforts to stretch their resources. She pressed her hand to her growling stomach, ignoring the pangs of hunger. Margaret needed whatever food was left far more than she did. Ellie, Margaret's voice, faint and trembling, broke the silence. "Don't go too far. The forest." "I know, Mama," Ellie whispered, her tone soft but resolute. "But I have to find something. I'll be careful. I promise." Ellie tucked the thin blanket tighter around her mother and brushed a strand of graying hair from her forehead. She forced a smile, though her heart ached at the sight of Margaret's sunken cheeks and fevered brow. Grabbing the small knife from the table, her only means of protection, she wrapped herself in her worn shawl and stepped outside. The forest greeted her with a cold embrace, the damp earth soft beneath her boots and the air heavy with the scent of pine and decay. Ellie had grown up among these trees. She knew their paths and secrets. But today, they felt different, darker, almost foreboding. The narrow trail leading away from the cabin was overgrown, and sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy above. Yet Ellie pressed on, her resolve unshaken. She whispered a quiet prayer, though she wasn't sure who might be listening. "Please, just let me find something. Anything." The forest seemed indifferent to her plea, offering only silence as she scoured the ground for edible plants. Her knife sliced through thorny vines that snagged her dress, and she scanned every shadow for signs of life. The weight of her mother's fragile condition bore down on her, pushing her forward despite her fear. After an hour of searching, Ellie spotted a cluster of berry bushes. The sight of the small, dark fruits glistening with dew brought a flicker of relief. Kneeling, she plucked them carefully, dropping each berry into the cloth pouch she had tied to her belt. They weren't much, but they were something. A small victory. But as Ellie reached for another berry, a sound pierced the quiet, a low, muffled groan. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The noise came again, faint but unmistakable, carried through the trees. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Logic urged her to turn back, to return to her mother and leave whatever was out there alone. But a deeper instinct, one rooted in empathy and courage, compelled her to investigate. Gripping her knife tightly, Ellie followed the sound, her steps cautious and deliberate. Rounding a thick tree, she found him, a man slumped against the roots, his leg caught in a jagged bear trap. Blood stained his trousers and the ground beneath him. And his face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat. He looked older than her, though not yet middle-aged. And his clothes, though torn and blooded, were far finer than anything she'd ever seen. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the horrifying scene. Her instinct was to run, to retreat to the safety of the cabin. But the man's chest rose and fell faintly, a weak sign of life that stirred something in her. His eyelids fluttered, and his cracked lips moved. "Help," he rasped, the word barely audible. Ellie blinked, shaking off the shock. She tightened her grip on the knife, though it felt useless here, and knelt beside him. "I'll help you," she said softly, her voice steadying. "I'll get you out." The bear trap was rusted and cruel. Its teeth sunk deep into the man's leg. Ellie's hands trembled as she worked to pry it open. Her fingers scraped raw by the metal. The man groaned in pain, his head lolling to the side. "I know it hurts," she murmured, her voice a mix of determination and sympathy. "But I can't leave you here." Finally, the trap released its hold, and Ellie pulled the man free. His leg was mangled, the wound deep and oozing. She tore a strip from her shawl, tying it tightly around his leg to slow the bleeding. Then, summoning strength she didn't know she had, she braced herself against his weight and began the arduous task of dragging him back to the cabin. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly as Ellie struggled under the man's weight. Her legs burned, her back ached, but she refused to stop. Thoughts of her mother's frail form and the man's desperate plea fueled her every step. When the cabin finally came into view, relief flooded her chest. "Mama," she called out, her voice breaking with exhaustion. "I need your help." Inside, Margaret stirred weakly, her confusion turning to alarm as Ellie dragged the stranger inside. The girl collapsed to her knees beside him, gasping for breath. "I found him in the forest," she explained. "His hurt bad. I couldn't leave him." Margaret's eyes widened with fear and uncertainty. "Ellie, what have you done?" Ellie's gaze was unwavering, her voice firm. "I helped him. Just like you taught me." Ellie's words hung heavy in the air, the kind of weight that comes with difficult choices made in moments of crisis. Margaret's trembling hands gripped the edge of her thin blanket as she stared at the man lying on their floor. His leg was bandaged in torn fabric, but blood seeped through, staining the rug beneath him. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and a faint sheen of sweat glistened on his dirt-streaked face. "Ellie," Margaret said, her voice weak but firm. "This man, he could be dangerous. He's too hurt to hurt us." Ellie countered gently, her voice trembling with both exhaustion and determination. "Mama, we couldn't leave him there. You always told me we have to help when we can." Margaret's face softened, though fear lingered in her eyes. "Child, the world isn't always kind to people like us. Bringing him here, it was the right thing to do." Ellie interrupted, kneeling beside the man and adjusting the makeshift bandage. She glanced up at her mother, her eyes pleading. "Please, Mama, just trust me." Margaret sighed, the fight draining from her as her frail body sank deeper into the bed. "Be careful," she murmured. "Do what you must." Ellie nodded, gratitude flickering across her face before she turned her full attention to the stranger. His features, though sharp and proud, were etched with pain. She wondered who he was, why he'd been out there in the woods. His fine clothes, now torn and blooded, suggested he didn't belong to the rugged life of the forest. A faint glint caught her eye, a gold watch peeking from his wrist, its surface smeared with dirt. "Who are you?" Ellie whispered, more to herself than to him. The man stirred faintly, a low groan escaping his lips. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing pale grey eyes clouded with confusion. He blinked several times, his gaze shifting from the cracked ceiling to the firelight flickering on the cabin walls before landing on Ellie. For a moment, he said nothing, his dry, cracked lips parting as if to speak but producing no sound. "It's okay," Ellie said softly, leaning closer. You're safe now. You're in my home. The man's gaze sharpened slightly, his brow furrowing as he tried to sit up. A sharp gasp escaped him, and he fell back against the floor, clutching his leg. Don't move, Ellie urged, pressing a gentle hand to his shoulder. You're hurt. Your leg, it was caught in a bear trap. I had to bring you here. He closed his eyes for a moment, his breathing labored as he processed her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and barely audible. Why did you help me? Ellie hesitated, the question catching her off guard. It wasn't something she'd stopped to think about. The memory of his broken figure in the woods flashed through her mind. The desperation in his groan. The way his pain mirrored the helplessness she felt every time she looked at her mother. Because you needed me, she said simply. And I couldn't let you die. The man's lips twitched faintly, almost forming a smile. But his exhaustion overtook him, and his head lolled to the side. Ellie glanced back at her mother, who was watching silently from the bed, her expression a mix of worry and reluctant pride. What do we do now? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ellie straightened, determination hardening her features. We keep him alive, she said. That's all we can do. The next few hours passed in a blur. Ellie worked tirelessly, cleaning the wound on the man's leg with cool water from the barrel in the corner of the cabin. The cut was deep, the skin around it bruised and angry. Every groan he let out sent chills down her spine. But she steeled herself, pressing the cloth harder to stop the bleeding, just as Margaret had instructed. As the firelight dimmed, the man stirred again. This time, his eyes opened longer, and his voice, though faint, carried a hint of urgency. My name is John, he said, the words barely audible. John Harwood. Ellie froze, the name unfamiliar but significant. She glanced at Margaret, whose brows knit together in thought. Harwood, she repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of it. Please, John continued, his voice trembling with pain. My family, in Ashwood. They'll help. Tell them. His words trailed off, his strength giving out. Ellie leaned closer, her heart pounding. I'll find them, she whispered. I'll get help. Margaret's voice broke through, firm but laced with fear. Ellie. No. You can't leave. It's too dangerous. Ellie turned to her mother, her face resolute. Mama. We don't have a choice. If we don't help him, he'll die. And if his family can help you too, her voice cracked. And she swallowed hard. I have to try. Margaret's eyes glistened with tears, but she nodded slowly, the weight of their circumstances pressing down on her. Be careful. My girl, she said softly. Promise me you'll come back. Ellie squeezed her mother's hand, her gaze steady. I promise. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the cabin's cracks, Ellie prepared herself for the journey ahead, her heart heavy but full of purpose. The morning light bathed the forest in hues of gold and green as Ellie stood at the edge of the narrow path leading away from the cabin. The weight of her mother's fragile hope and John's faint plea for help bore down on her shoulders. Clutching a small satchel filled with stale bread and a canteen of water, she tightened her shawl around her and stepped forward. The air was crisp, biting at her cheeks and fingertips. The forest was familiar, yet it felt different today, heavier, more alive with unspoken whispers. Ellie kept her gaze forward, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. You've walked these paths 1,000 times, she murmured to herself, her breath fogging in the cool air. Just keep going. One step at a time. The ground beneath her boots was soft with moisture, the smell of damp earth and pine filling her nose. Birds chirped faintly above, their songs a reminder that life continued even in the face of hardship. Ellie's sharp eyes scanned the forest floor for potential hazards, her mind racing with what lay ahead. Ashwood was a half-day's journey longer, given the winding trails and her need to remain cautious. As the morning passed, Ellie's focus narrowed to the rhythm of her steps and the rustling of leaves around her. She chewed on a piece of bread from her satchel, rationing it carefully. Each bite felt like a small victory against the gnawing hunger in her belly. Yet, no matter how determined she was, doubts crept into her mind. What if she lost her way? What if wild animals were lurking nearby? What if John's family wouldn't believe her or, worse, turned her away? No, Ellie said firmly, shaking the thoughts from her head. He's counting on me. Mama's counting on me. By midday, the sun climbed higher, its rays piercing through the canopy and casting dappled light on the forest floor. Ellie paused to catch her breath by a fallen log, the coolness of the air sharp in her lungs. Her legs ached, and her hands trembled as she drank from her canteen. She allowed herself only a few moments to rest before pushing forward. The forest seemed to shift around her as she ventured deeper. The once familiar paths were obscured by overgrown brush and twisted roots. Ellie hesitated at a fork in the trail, her chest tightening. She tried to remember her mother's advice, the lessons she'd been taught about the woods since childhood. Keep the sun to your left in the morning, she whispered. Follow the wind. She chose the left path and continued, her resolve firm despite the growing unease in her chest. The silence around her deepened, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig beneath her boots. Every sound made her heart race, her knife a comforting weight in her hand. As she rounded a dense thicket, Ellie froze. A sharp snap echoed nearby, followed by a low growl. Her breath caught as she turned her head toward the noise. Peering through the underbrush, she saw them, two golden eyes staring back at her. A wolf. The creature was sleek and grey, its body half hidden by ferns. Its eyes were fixed on her, unblinking, and Ellie felt her pulse thunder in her ears. Her fingers tightened around the satchel strap, and she took a slow step back. It's okay, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm just passing through. The wolf tilted its head slightly, as though weighing her words. Ellie's mind raced with the lessons her mother had taught her. Don't run. Don't make sudden movements. And don't show fear. But fear coursed through her veins, threatening to betray her composure. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the wolf turned away. Its ears twitched toward a sound deeper in the forest, and it slinked back into the shadows, leaving Ellie alone once more. Her legs trembled as she exhaled a shaky breath. She whispered to herself, "Not today." Ellie pressed on, her steps quicker now, her resolve bolstered by relief. The encounter had left her shaken, but she refused to let it stop her. She thought of her mother, lying in the cabin, and of John, his pale face etched with pain. They needed her to be strong. By late afternoon, the trees began to thin, and Ellie caught glimpses of open sky through the branches. Her pace quickened as the forest gave way to a wide, open field. The town of Ashwood lay in the distance, its outlines faint but unmistakable. Ellie's heart soared. She had made it this far. Wiping the sweat from her brow, she adjusted the satchel on her shoulder and stepped into the field. Each step brought her closer to the promise of help, of hope, and of the possibility of saving the two people who mattered most to her in the world. The town of Ashwood bustled with life as Ellie approached its edge. The sights and sounds of a place so different from her quiet forest filled her senses, a cacophony of carriage wheels clattering over cobblestones, merchants calling out their wares, and the mingling chatter of townsfolk. Ellie felt small amidst the unfamiliar chaos, her dirt-streaked face and patched clothes drawing curious glances. Clutching her satchel tightly to her chest, Ellie kept her head down and weaved through the crowded streets. Her heart pounded as she searched for any sign of the address John had given her. The card tucked in her pocket felt like a lifeline, but the sheer size of the town overwhelmed her. Her feet carried her toward a large iron gate, and as she drew closer, her breath hitched. A golden plaque affixed to the gate read, "Harwood Estate." Ellie stared at the mansion beyond the gate. It was grander than anything she could have imagined. Its tall windows reflecting the late afternoon sun and its gardens sprawling with perfect symmetry. The air here was different, crisp and clean, untainted by the earthy scent of the forest. She hesitated, unsure if she truly belonged in a place like this. But John's weak voice echoed in her mind, "They'll help. Tell them." With trembling hands, she stepped toward the gate, only to be stopped by a sharp voice. "What business do you have here?" A tall man in a dark suit appeared from a small side gatehouse, his stern expression scrutinizing her. Ellie faltered, clutching her satchel tighter. I need to speak to someone. It's important. A man named John Harwood is hurt. He sent me." The man's frown deepened, his gaze sweeping over her disheveled appearance. "And who are you?" Swallowing hard, Ellie reached into her pocket and pulled out the card John had given her. She held it out, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "He gave me this. Please. He needs help." The man hesitated, his eyes darting between the card and Ellie's earnest face. Finally, he opened the gate just wide enough for her to step through. "Wait here," he said curtly before disappearing down the gravel path toward the mansion. Ellie stood in the shadow of the gate, her heart hammering in her chest as minutes stretched into what felt like hours. She glanced back toward the bustling town, a flicker of doubt threatening to root her in place. But then the mansion's front door burst open, and a woman in an elegant dress stepped out. Her movements were quick, her face pale with worry as her eyes locked onto Ellie. "Did you say John Harwood?" the woman called out, her voice trembling. Ellie nodded, stepping forward. "Yes. He's alive. But he's hurt. He's at my home. In the forest." The woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "My husband. He's alive." She turned sharply toward the house, shouting, "Prepare the helicopter, now." Ellie's eyes widened as the words registered. Helicopter? She had never seen one, let alone imagined that such a thing could exist. Moments later, the rhythmic thrum of rotor blades filled the air, growing louder as the aircraft descended onto a large lawn behind the estate. The sound was deafening, sending vibrations through Ellie's chest. A team of rescuers, dressed in sharp uniforms, emerged from the mansion, carrying medical kits and other supplies. One of the men approached Ellie, his voice firm but kind. "You're the one who found him?" Ellie nodded. "Yes, sir. He's at my cabin. And, my mama. She's sick too. Please. Can you help her?" The man's expression softened, and he gestured to the helicopter. "We'll help both of them. Lead the way." Ellie climbed into the helicopter, her small frame dwarfed by the towering figures around her. The machine roared to life, lifting off the ground with a force that made her stomach flip. As they soared above the town, she caught her first glimpse of the world from above. The forest stretched endlessly below, its dense canopy a sea of green that seemed almost surreal. When they reached the clearing near the cabin, Ellie pointed frantically toward the small structure. The helicopter touched down, and the team sprang into action. Paramedics rushed into the cabin, emerging moments later with John on a stretcher. He looked even weaker now, his face pale and his breathing shallow. But his eyes fluttered open as he was carried toward the helicopter. "You did it," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Thank you." Ellie felt her throat tighten, and she managed a small smile. "I promised I would." Meanwhile, another team brought her mother out on a second stretcher. Margaret's frail body shivered beneath the blanket they had wrapped around her, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Ellie," she called weakly. Ellie ran to her side, grabbing her mother's hand and squeezing it tightly. "I'm here. Mama. You're going to be okay. They're taking us to the city. They're going to help." Margaret's eyes glistened with tears as she whispered, "You did this, my brave girl." As the helicopter lifted into the sky, Ellie sat beside her mother, holding her hand tightly, for the first time in months. Hope burned brightly in her chest. The forest grew smaller below, the cabin disappearing from view, and Ellie allowed herself to believe that their lives were about to change forever. The Harwood estate stood like a fortress of grandeur against the horizon as the helicopter descended onto its sprawling grounds. Ellie's heart raced as she looked out at the manicured gardens and the towering mansion that seemed to stretch toward the sky. The stark contrast between this world and her small cabin in the woods was almost too much to comprehend. As the helicopter touched down, a team of doctors and nurses rushed forward, their movements brisk and efficient. Margaret was whisked away on a stretcher, her frail form barely visible beneath the layers of blankets. Ellie clung to her mother's hand until the last possible moment, her chest tightening as they disappeared through the mansion's grand doors. A gentle hand rested on Ellie's shoulder, and she turned to see the woman who had greeted her at the gate. "Your mother will receive the best care," she said softly, her voice laced with genuine kindness. "And so will you." Ellie nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out beneath her. Exhaustion and uncertainty weighed heavily on her as she was guided into the mansion. The interior was even more magnificent than she had imagined. High ceilings adorned with glittering chandeliers, polished wooden floors, and walls decorated with paintings that seemed older than time itself. Everything felt too pristine, too perfect, and Ellie couldn't help but feel out of place. "This way," the woman said, leading Ellie through a wide corridor. "We've prepared a room for you." Ellie followed, her steps hesitant. The room they entered was small compared to the rest of the house, but it felt impossibly large to her. A soft bed with fresh linens sat against one wall, a small desk with neatly stacked books beside it, and a window that overlooked the vast gardens below. Sunlight streamed in, painting the space in warm, golden hues. "This is for me?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded, a gentle smile on her lips. "Yes, my dear. This is your space now." Ellie stepped into the room, running her fingers over the smooth wood of the desk. She had never seen anything so fine, let alone imagined it could belong to her. Her gaze lingered on the bed, the blankets so soft and inviting that they felt like a dream. For a moment, she stood frozen, unsure of how to process the overwhelming kindness she had been shown. "Rest," the woman said, her voice soothing. "You've been through so much. Let us take care of you now." Ellie nodded slowly, but even as the woman left, she couldn't bring herself to sit. Her mind raced with thoughts of her mother, of John, and of the cabin they had left behind. Everything was changing so quickly, and while a part of her felt relief, another part wrestled with the unfamiliarity of it all. Later that evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and purple, Ellie ventured out into the gardens. The air was cool and filled with the scent of blooming flowers. She wandered through the neatly trimmed hedges and vibrant flower beds, her footsteps light against the gravel paths. It was beautiful, almost magical, yet it felt surreal. Her solitude was interrupted by the soft tap of a cane against the path. Turning, she saw John Harwood approaching, his frame steadied by the cane but his expression warm and relieved. He looked better now, though his movements were slow and deliberate. He smiled faintly as he reached her. "Ellie," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "I wanted to thank you." Ellie's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her hands. "You don't have to thank me. I just did what anyone would do." John chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "Not anyone. You saved my life, Ellie. Without you, I wouldn't be standing here." She glanced up at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. "You're welcome," she said softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. John gestured toward the garden around them. "This place, everything here, it's yours now too. You and your mother will never have to struggle again. You've given me a second chance, and I intend to make sure you have one too." Ellie's chest tightened at his words, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief swirling within her. "Mama won't take charity," she murmured, her voice small. "This isn't charity," John replied, his tone firm but kind. It's gratitude. You showed me compassion when no one else would. Let me repay that kindness. Ellie looked around at the sprawling gardens, the mansion that loomed behind them, and the sky that stretched endlessly above. For the first time, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter, and a spark of hope flickered in her heart. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. For everything. John smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. This is just the beginning. Ellie, you've earned it. As they stood together beneath the fading light, Ellie felt the warmth of possibility for the first time. A new life was unfolding before her. And though it was unfamiliar and daunting, she knew she wasn't alone. The following days at the Harwood estate passed in a strange, dreamlike blur for Ellie. The grandeur of the mansion still felt surreal, but the warmth of its residents began to soften the edges of her apprehension. The staff, from the kind housekeeper who left extra bread at her bedside to the gardener who welcomed her curiosity, treated her with a respect she had never known. For the first time in her life, Ellie felt seen not as a burden or a child struggling to survive, but as someone valued and deserving of kindness. Her mother, Margaret, was recovering well under the care of skilled doctors. Each time Ellie visited her room, Margaret's cheeks looked rosier, her breath steadier. One morning, Margaret reached out and cupped Ellie's face with hands that were still frail but warmer than they had been in months. You've done so much, Ellie, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. You've given us a chance I never thought we'd have. Ellie swallowed hard, blinking back tears. You don't need to thank me, Mama. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. That afternoon, Ellie found herself walking through the gardens again, her favorite place on the estate. The vibrant flowers reminded her of the wild beauty of the forest. But here, everything was orderly, cared for, and thriving. She knelt beside a bed of roses, gently brushing her fingers against the soft petals, when the sound of John's cane on the gravel path made her look up. Ellie. John greeted her with a warm smile. He seemed stronger with each passing day, his pale complexion giving way to healthier hues. Though he still leaned on his cane, his steps were surer now. Mr. Harwood, Ellie replied, standing quickly and brushing the dirt from her hands. Call me John, he said with a chuckle. You've earned that. Ellie smiled shyly and nodded. What brings you out here? I thought it was time we did something together, John said, gesturing to a small sapling being carried by one of the gardeners. Its tender green leaves fluttered in the breeze, and its roots were wrapped carefully in burlap. I want us to plant this tree. Ellie tilted her head, curiosity lighting her features. Why a tree? John stepped closer, his gaze soft. Because trees take time to grow. They need care, patience, and strong roots to thrive. Just like people. Ellie's heart swelled at his words, and she followed him to a spot in the center of the garden where a small hole had been dug. Together, they worked to plant the sapling. Ellie held it steady while John guided its roots into the earth. The gardener handed them shovels, and they took turns covering the roots with soil. Each scoop of earth felt like more than just an act, it felt like they were planting something greater than a tree. A promise. Perhaps. A new beginning. When the work was done, they stood back and admired the tiny tree. It was small, almost fragile, but its leaves stretched toward the sun with quiet determination. It's beautiful, Ellie murmured, her voice filled with wonder. John placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression one of deep gratitude. So are you, Ellie. You've been through so much, but you've come out stronger. You've changed my life, and you've reminded me what it means to care for others. Ellie looked up at him, her eyes wide. I just did what I had to do. And that, John said, his tone firm but gentle, is what makes you extraordinary. Margaret joined them a moment later, her steps slow but steady. She rested a hand on Ellie's shoulder and gazed at the sapling, her eyes misty with emotion. It's perfect, she said softly. Just like this second chance you've given us. Ellie wrapped her arm around her mother, holding her close. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't dared to believe in: peace. The weight of their struggles was beginning to lift, replaced by a hope that felt as solid as the earth beneath their feet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in hues of orange and gold, John turned to them with a smile. "This estate isn't just mine anymore. It belongs to all of us. We're family now." Ellie's chest tightened with emotion, and tears welled in her eyes. "Family," she whispered, the word feeling foreign yet warm on her tongue. John nodded. "Family isn't about blood, Ellie. It's about the people who stand by you, who lift you up when you can't carry yourself. That's what you've done for me. And now it's my turn to do the same for you." As the three of them stood together by the sapling, the world seemed to hold its breath. The tree, small and tender, symbolized something far greater than its size. It was a reminder of resilience, love, and the profound impact of one act of kindness. Ellie looked up at the sky, now painted with stars, and whispered, "We'll grow tall and strong, just like this tree." John smiled, his voice steady as he replied, "Yes, Ellie. Together, we will." As the stars sparkled above the Harwood estate, the world around Ellie, Margaret, and John seemed to settle into a peaceful stillness. The sapling stood proudly in the garden, a symbol of hope and new beginnings. Ellie held her mother's hand tightly, her heart full of gratitude and warmth. For the first time in years, she felt safe, loved, and part of something bigger than herself. John turned to Ellie and Margaret, his eyes reflecting the light of the stars. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. "Together, we'll grow, just like that tree." Ellie nodded, a smile spreading across her face. She had learned that even the smallest acts of kindness could change lives. Her courage and compassion had not only saved John's life but had also forged a bond that would last forever. As they stood there, surrounded by the beauty of the garden and the promise of a brighter future, Ellie realized she had found more than safety, she had found a family. If this story of courage, love, and second chances touched your heart, subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales. Every story is a reminder that hope and kindness can transform lives. Don't miss the next chapter.